Awesome. All right, so a look at the agenda for today. Today, we'll provide a high-level overview of the timelines for executing your agreements and grant milestones. We'll walk through some grant administration basics. We'll briefly dive into the fundamentals of grant administration just to ensure compliance and just to ensure you all know how to manage your ESG funds. We will also go through FAQs and where you can find the answers to commonly asked questions, as well as other resources. And again, we will have some time at the end to go through questions, but feel free to put those into the chat as we go. Next slide. Thank you. All right. So for ESG 23, I believe you all are aware at this point, but we are aiming to have these agreements executed by April 1st of this year, just a few weeks away. We do want to make sure that you all are aware that this agreement will expire March 31st, 2025. Your agreement will not be in effect until all parties have signed the agreement, so just keep that in mind. If there are any delays or changes, our team will definitely contact you in advance. One thing to note is that, delays do sometimes happen and they are out of our control. So we do ask that you try to plan for this with your team just to make sure you're doing the best that you can, and just make sure that you're staying on top of communications from your grant manager. When you do get your agreement, it will come through DocuSign. You do want to make sure that the signature authority listed on the agreement is correct. We do have a lot of delays that come about when the signature authority has changed. So you do want to make sure you alert your grant manager immediately so that there aren't any delays to your agreement. Once you do get that agreement before signing, we do ask that you review it again. Many of you, there may be a handful of you that have not received your draft yet. However, the most of you have gotten the draft and you should have read through it, but you'll need to read it again once it comes through DocuSign. Don't just sign it, pay close attention to it, make sure you understand the agreement, and the team responsible for the agreement also understands. Next slide. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Olivia, who will give you guys more information about eligible activities.
Thanks, Whitney. Good morning, everybody. This is Olivia, one of the ESG grant managers. Currently, my grantees are mainly in the Balance of State region. So there are 6 program components under the ESG grant that you are able to spend in. These are street outreach, emergency shelter, homeless prevention, rapid rehousing, HMIS, and we do have admin as a component. I believe most grantees were not funded with admin expenses for ESG 23. Sorry, can you go back to that slide? Thanks. And so there is some distinction on who is served under each of these components. For those experiencing homelessness currently, they would be supported by street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and people who are at risk of homelessness per the HUD definitions would be served by homelessness prevention. And regardless of their homelessness status, if they are receiving services through your programs, we want to make sure that you are collecting this data on HMIS, homelessness management information systems, or a comparable database if you are a DV provider. Okay, we can go do the next slide, please. So as far as emergency shelter and street outreach, these provide similar services in terms of eligible activities. So case management, essential services such as supplies, transportation needs, medical needs, and these are all outlined more in detail in the emergency shelter policies and procedures on our website, as well as, if you look up emergency solution grant eligible activities, you'll find a plethora of resources that outline all of these activities in easy read formats. So I recommend finding one that works for you and your team. So as far as emergency shelter and street outreach, the distinction with these services is where the clients are currently living. So if they're living out of doors and not residing in a shelter, then folks would be served by street outreach services. Whereas if they are currently residing in a sheltered space, then they would be served by emergency shelter funds instead. You cannot use street outreach funds for folks who are residing in currently in a sheltered facility, because these are funds that are designed for folks living out of doors and experiencing out of doors homelessness. Otherwise, the eligible activities are relatively the same in terms of what you can spend on. Next slide, please. Homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing are similar. The types of assistance under each program are the same. So we have relocation and stabilization services. We have relocation and stabilization financial assistance, and then we have rental assistance. So services are case management, transportation for staff, those types of expenses. Financial assistance would be things like your application fees, those types of fees, and then obviously rental assistance would be rent payments as well as rental arrears. So these, again, are similar under prevention and rapid rehousing, except the distinction is with rapid rehousing. This is folks who are receiving usually longer term supports, and they are moving from an experience of homelessness into housing, whereas prevention is preventing that experience of homelessness altogether. So they haven't experienced a period of homelessness, and this fund is being used to prevent that experience from happening for that client. There are some parameters in terms of short-term or medium-term assistance, and those are marked by kind of the date timeframes. Next slide, please. So I will hand this over to Aaliyah to go over some of the administration basics that we ask for these grants.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaliyah, and I'm a grant manager. Most of my grantees are in the NOCO and the MDHI COC. So for this section of the webinar, we're going to cover the basics of grant administration, including an overview of pay requests, data collection and reporting, the different roles of fiscal agents, policies and procedures, monitoring, and a couple of other things. But please remember that your grant manager will always be your first point of contact and your primary contact throughout your grant cycle. So if you do have any questions that come out, please reach out to your grant manager first. Next slide. So ESG operates as a reimbursement grant, which means we require proof of payment and proof of service for all pay request reimbursements. All of this documentation should be uploaded into Neighborly, and it'll be reviewed by your grant manager. There is a pay request cover sheet that's required for every pay request submission. Your grant manager will provide you with this cover sheet template at the start of your grant cycle, and it's also located on the ESG website. But if your pay request does not include this cover sheet, it will be rejected and you will be asked to resubmit it. Grantees are required to submit a pay request each quarter and should try to have at least one submitted within 20 days after each quarter, unless otherwise specified in your grant agreement. And it's super important that all documentation is uploaded in an organized manner and that it could be understood by an outside third party. So place each documentation for proof of service and proof of payment together for each individual purpose. So for example, if you're submitting documents for an internet bill, you would want to include an invoice, which would serve as the proof of service, and then a check or ACH payment to show proof of payment, and both of these documents should be placed together. For proof of service, every ESG expense in the request requires proof of service and cost incurred. Examples for that would be an invoice, a bill, an itemized receipt, a timesheet that breaks out ESG time by activity. And then for proof of payment, every ESG expense should have a corresponding proof of payment. Examples of that would include a check or a bank statement or a payroll summary or a pay stub. And next, we'll kind of review different resources created to help with ESG pay requests. And there's a ton that are also available on the ESG DOH webpage. Next slide. So the neighborly subrecipient user guide, we're going to outline pay request processes, but the neighborly subrecipient user guide really covers this in more detail on how to use the system, but I'll provide like a general overview of the process. So grantees should submit pay requests using Neighborly by creating a draw and uploading the necessary documentation that we just discussed to this draw, which includes the cover sheet, the proof of service, and then the proof of payments. If these documents aren't provided, you'll have your request returned, which means it'll be sent back for follow-up. Once the grant manager approves it, it moves into our internal accounting department who actually sends out the payment. And then you will notice it'll show as dispersed in Neighborly versus pending approval. And if everything looks good to go, your grant manager will approve your draw request and it'll be further reviewed by the accounting department who will then issue funds via EFT. Some individuals might be receiving actual checks, but we highly, highly encourage everyone to actually be set up for EFT. DOH has a 45-day window for sending out payments and reviewing your pay request once it's been created in Neighborly. And this timeline resets if the initial request was not fully or correctly submitted. And if you need your funds to be released a little quicker than that, then just reach out to your grant manager to see what type of accommodations can be made. But please note that I use the terms pay requests and draw requests interchangeably, but those both mean the same thing, just not to confuse anyone. Next slide. Okay, here's what you need to do to get paid. Here are a few do's and don'ts that I like to cover in regards to pay requests. So as mentioned previously, it's important that you use the ESG approved cover sheet with all pay request submissions to avoid delays. And it's important that you charge expenses to the correct component. So for example, if you're wanting reimbursement for an electric bill, that should be charged to emergency shelter and not street outreach. I encourage you all to visit the ESG regulations page as well. And I have this hyperlinked in the presentation right here where you can easily access it. But this provides a great overview of eligible expenses per component. So definitely take a look at that. And if you still have questions after you've reviewed that, then don't hesitate to reach out to your grant manager for more clarification. Also be sure to include corresponding documents for proof of payment with every expense. It's also really important that you compile your pay requests in an organized manner so that proof of service and your proof of payment documents are directly aligned and everything's not really scattered. Ensure every document that has been included is noted on the pay request cover sheet. So if it's not included on the cover sheet or there's no place to note a certain document, then remove it as a document because it's likely not needed. And then be sure to please include as few documents as possible. You should only upload the cover sheet as an Excel document in the same way that it will be sent to you. And then all the proofs of service and the proofs of payment can be uploaded as one PDF file. If the documents aren't provided, the documents aren't provided that you should have provided, then your request will be returned back to you and you'll be asked for follow-up documents. Next slide. When submitting, so these are a couple of don'ts that we'll go through now, but when submitting pay requests, please be sure not to include any of your participants' personal information. We would like to keep that protected. And also don't include documentation that is not relevant to proof of service or proof of payment. For example, we would never ask for copies of W-9s because this does not demonstrate a proof of payment or a proof of service. Instead, we would ask for a timesheet and a pay stub. That is a more accurate depiction of proof of service and proof of payment. Pay requests that don't have the necessary documentation or information will be returned for follow-up, as I mentioned. And do not consolidate your entire pay request expenses into one category. It's important to separate each expense out into its appropriate funding category, and this should be reflected on the pay request cover sheet as well. Be sure to review the ESG regulations, as I mentioned, prior to submitting your pay request in order to determine if an expense is eligible for reimbursement or not. This will save you a ton of time. But again, after reviewing the regulations, if you still have additional questions, you can always reach out to your grant manager for clarification. And then funding for administration was removed for ESG 23, so this is not an eligible component. One last thing is to note that ledgers can be included in addition to the pay request cover sheet, but ledgers alone do not serve as proof of service or a proof of payment unless they've been exported from a formal accounting system that's a part of your organization's official record keeping system. And the ledger would need to include details on the cleared payment, including the check number or the card number. So you can use a ledger, but you absolutely do need to have the pay request cover sheet on top of that, as well as proof of service and proof of payment. Next slide, and I'm going to pass it back over to Whitney.
Thanks, Aaliyah. All right, everyone. So now we will talk about ESG reporting and the different systems we use to collect client data. So tracking client data enables us to assess outcomes, identify ongoing needs, and strategically plan for future funding opportunities. So some of you may be aware, maybe some of you aren't aware, but we use the Neighborly portal for our grant management system here on the ESG program. Grantees are required to submit quarterly reports on Neighborly. We have noticed that this hasn't been tracked very well in the past, and we do want you all to be aware that we are definitely going to be tracking this more this grant cycle. So we do want to flag for you all just that they're due quarterly, and you need to make sure that they are submitted accurately and on time. SAGE is the federal grant management system. So HUD ESG requires recipients to pull capers from HMIS or CAFE if you're a victim service provider, and you're required to upload them into SAGE annually. So if you are getting HUD ESG funding, you are going to be required to do a SAGE upload. If you are being funded under Prop 123, this will not be a requirement because Prop 123 is state funding, and it's not a requirement for state funds to go into the HUD SAGE system. However, all recipients are required to use HMIS unless you're a victim service provider. So either way, if you have HUD ESG, you're going to be required to upload it into SAGE at the end of the year. If you have Prop 123, you're going to be uploading it into Neighborly. For victim service providers, you will use CAFE, which is the comparable database to HMIS. We are aware that we are working through some challenges right now with CAFE and just getting that cleaned up. So Kat who is the grant manager for all victim service providers, she'll reach out to you soon to provide a separate training on CAFE once we get all of those bugs cleared up in that system. Next slide. Perfect, thank you. Again, Neighborly is where you will be tracking your quarterly reports. For the ESG program, we start on April for our grant cycle, April 1st. So your first ESG caper will be due on July 20th. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're ready to upload that. We do have contact information for the HMIS leads. If you're not sure how to get set up or how to pull your capers, we want to make sure you're connected with those leads so that you can get the training you need to meet your requirement within your agreement. Again, failure to submit reports accurately and timely will result in delays in your payments. So just be sure to get those in on time. If you get an email from your grant manager letting you know that your report is missing, please be sure to hop on that to avoid any delays. We do require that the caper for Neighborly be uploaded in a PDF format. It's just a lot better for us to be able to pull your paper as a PDF rather than the CSV file. If you're unsure how to convert your caper into a PDF, please reach out to your grant manager so that they can get you connected to the HMIS leads to provide additional training on how to pull those as a PDF. And one other thing to note about the quarterly reports, on Neighborly right now, it is set up to allow you guys to upload the capers at the start of each quarter. However, we would like for you all, when you upload your quarterly reports, to always use the April 1st start date. So for example, when your second report is due, you're going to do April 1st through September. You'll get more information by email from your grant manager, but just a heads up, Neighborly doesn't have the ability for us to start it on April 1st. So we just have to continue to communicate with you all to let you know that you should be pulling it starting April 1st for each report you upload. Next slide. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and pass this section over to Kat, who will go over policies and procedures and our monitoring.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kat. I am the grant manager that supports the victim service providers across the state. So I've got a little bit of everything when it comes to the COC areas. I will be going over what everybody is most excited to hear about, which is monitoring. So we do kind of categorize every year how monitoring will go. And we have a set of ESG policies and procedures on our website that outlines all of the written requirements and regulations that HUD has documented for ESG. So like I said, we do have these policies and procedures on our website, and a big part of monitoring and ensuring that you have everything set up for your program is having those written policies and procedures in place. It is a requirement for federal and state funding. It means that you as subrecipients do need to have your own written policies and procedures in place. You're welcome to use the ones that are posted on our website as a basis for creating your own. However, as a direct service provider, you are going to need to add a few policies to your version. This includes an intake procedure, eligibility and ineligibility requirements, record collection and maintenance for both eligible and ineligible clients, including their backup documentation, financial policies that meet generally accepted accounting practices, policies for coordination of care with the COCs, coordinated entry systems, and HMIS, confidentiality policies, and grievance and appeals policies. Our best practice is to document everything. If it's not written when we monitor, then it does not exist. We'll go on to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to go over what homeless documentation is. Homeless documentation is a document that establishes and verifies homeless status. It's required at intake for ESG rapid rehousing and homeless prevention participants, and is highly recommended for street outreach, emergency shelter, and victim service providers. A lack of third-party documentation does not prevent a participant from being immediately admitted to emergency shelter, receiving street outreach services, or being immediately admitted to shelter or receiving services that are provided by a victim service provider. But keep in mind that obtaining that documentation will help a participant with receiving homeless prevention and rapid rehousing services in the future. Documentation needs to be specific to the participant. It needs to list the eligibility criteria, and it needs to provide a date that's relevant to the grant cycle. Procedures for homeless documentation must establish that the order of priority for obtaining evidence follows HUD guidelines. So they require that you first try and obtain evidence of a third-party documentation, such as a referral or an eviction notice. If you can't obtain that, then the second option is observations from an intake worker. And the third option is certification from the person seeking assistance as a last resort. So if you can't get the first, try and get the second. If you can't get the second, try and get the third. Regardless of your ESG program type, we will ask for your policies and procedures on homeless documentation during monitoring. Next slide. So monitoring is not a bad thing. I know that not everybody likes it, but it is a way for us to provide extra support and guidance, as well as build a better foundation for you and the state to collaborate. It's why we are really always in monitoring mode, most of the time in an ongoing or informal process. Ongoing monitoring is our regular communication and activities relating to your grant. So that includes conversations that we have around your agency's projects and activities, pay requests, and other ESG subjects that might come up. For example, when we provide technical assistance or feedback, it falls under the umbrella of monitoring. That helps us to collect data on individual agencies' growth, areas of improvement, and areas where they might need a little bit of extra assistance, while also building a basis for additional funding requests. We do have a secondary form of monitoring, which we call formal monitoring. This is that scheduled session that involves a more in-depth dive into your agency. It can be either in person or virtual, and it usually focuses on ensuring that HUD and state requirements are being met. It begins with a risk assessment to determine any perceived risks, such as not having been formally monitored within a 3-year period, being a new grantee, having a new ESG component, or having significant changes to your staff or your program. So what happens during a formal monitoring session? When we do that risk assessment, if an agency is perceived to have a higher risk, then they'll be notified at least 1 calendar month in advance to schedule, and they'll be provided with information on what we're looking for, along with a copy of the risk assessment and monitoring templates. We're happy to answer any questions that you have beforehand. We offer a virtual entrance meeting before the official session, and we ask that you provide us with information and documents before our actual meeting. We may schedule a tour if necessary. So for example, our emergency shelters, we typically will schedule a tour. We do complete a report after monitoring and we send it back to you. If there's any concerns or findings, then we work with you directly to find solutions and help support in that area. Next slide. All right, so that risk assessment I was talking about. Every year, we as grant managers complete a risk assessment form, which can be found on our ESG website. The risk assessment focuses on 5 main categories. We focus on grant management, financial management, services and satisfaction, shelters and facilities, and fiscal agent management. The last 2 categories shelters and facilities, and fiscal agent management may not apply to everyone. Under each of those categories is a set of questions. For example, under shelters and facilities, there's a question relating to on-site monitoring and when it was last completed. Your grant manager assigns a score to each question based on a specified set of criteria. Each criteria then corresponds to a risk category, low, medium, or high. For example, a new program or a program that hasn't been monitored in the last 2 years would be considered, and I'm saying this with air quotes, high risk. Based on the culmination of each category in the assessment and regulatory requirements, we then determine whether your program needs to be formally monitored. Regulatory requirements do play a large factor in formal monitoring and whether or not you are, again, air quotes, high risk. It's not always a good indicator of whether your program is successful. So do keep that in mind. If your agency is chosen for formal monitoring, you have more than one ESG funded program, then the risk assessment is used to determine which programs will be monitored. We'll use those monitoring templates based on HUD monitoring guidance and take a deeper dive into each of your programs. Before and during formal monitoring, your grant manager will become familiar with the design and operation of your program, particularly any areas that have been identified as high risk or that are the subject of monitoring. We communicate any questions we have, we review client files and policies and procedures, and just generally learn more about your agency and what you do. We use information from this to complete the monitoring templates that correspond to those program areas. And regardless of whether you have never been monitored or were just monitored yesterday, please, please, please always make sure that your policies and procedures are up to date and ready to be monitored. Because, again, golden rule, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. And we'll go to the next slide. All right, along with those written policies and procedures, we will request client records during the formal monitoring. Records need to be from within the requested timeframe, typically the dates of the grant cycle, and will include homelessness documentation that I mentioned earlier, HMIS intake, hard copies of an intake if applicable, the type of assistance, termination documentation if applicable, habitability, lead-based paint certifications, client income, fair market rent and rent reasonableness if applicable, leases and rental assistance agreements and recertifications, again, if applicable. Move on to the next slide. So some examples of what an ESG record would look like when we're requesting it for rapid rehousing or homeless prevention. I want you to think of the client record like a summary of a story or a movie. We need to see a beginning, a middle, and an end, or a to be continued. So an example of this client record would include their eligibility, so homeless verification, income verification, their intake that includes proof that they received policy information, and their service provision. So did they, get housed? Do they have case notes that show that they moved into housing or received services? Any records of financial assistance, the type, amount, dates, and evaluations and reevaluations, including housing stability plans. If they were terminated or they successfully graduated from the program, then we would also need proof of that. Please, please, please keep in mind that personally identifying information does need to be redacted from these. And we'll go to the next slide, and I'm going to hand it over to Olivia.
Thanks, Kat. So we do, on occasion, have some training opportunities and just some in-depth engagement on topics that surround the Emergency Solutions Grant and generally the work that we are all involved with. So monthly, Aaliyah holds DOH office hours, and these are typically topics that are TA focused, so troubleshooting areas that it seems we get a lot of questions around or just want to share more details on. For instance, talking about our quarterly reports and making sure those capers are consistent and collecting the data that we like to see and need to see. Additionally, we have started holding community conversations. These are typically quarterly, and these are just more in-depth conversations. We usually hear from a couple grantees who are implementing specific parts of the work. So recently we just had a landlord engagement discussion. And then this is just kind of an open conversation for everybody to talk and engage about how they do this work, where challenges come up, how people are troubleshooting, really just as a space for us to learn from each other and hear how we are all working through this together. And we can go to the next slide. So kind of alongside this, these are all saved. These webinars are all saved under the webinars tag in our toolbox. So on our emergency solutions grant page on the DOH, on the DOLA Colorado website, we have just a toolkit with just some helpful resources, as well as documents that we require of you for grant management. So this would be where you could find a new copy of your pay request form, your ledger, the neighborly toolkit, and just different questions that come up frequently, such as what kind of things can I use for match? What do I need for monitoring? Those types of questions. So these are all in our grant management toolkit, which is on our website. So feel free to explore that and let us know if there's something missing that would be helpful to add to this toolkit. And next slide, please. And I'll pass it back to Whitney.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That actually will conclude our presentation. Does anyone have any questions for us? I do see a few in the chat that we have gotten to, but anything else? All right, and we do, Kat, if you can drop that FAQ form into the chat, feel free to add additional questions that may come up later, especially as you start getting those agreements in DocuSign. You can either reach out directly to your grant manager or myself, or you can complete this form where our team will meet and discuss the questions and be able to provide a consistent answer to all of you. All right. Anything else? This was a quick one today. So definitely want to answer any questions that you all have. All right. Okay. Well, happy Thursday. We'll stick on the call just for a little bit longer. But otherwise, we hope everyone has a great day. I heard a hand. Lauren.
Hi, Whitney. I just put my question in the chat. But now everybody's saying thank you, so I'll just ask it. Is there a reason why admin was lowered so significantly and not given in multiple contracts, as it is so important to have that line open for matching and necessary for program integrity and proper monitoring?
Yeah, the short answer is that we had to use the ESG admin dollars for our staff to help manage the program. But if you want to talk about it more, we could definitely discuss. We do allow for indirect costs. So we have had conversations with many grantees to feel free to use the indirect costs. You can use up to 10% for each component in lieu of admin. But if you all have any more questions about that specifically, definitely reach out to me, or I'm happy to set up a time for us all to meet.
Okay, thank you, Whitney.
Of course. And then there's still, someone go ahead.
Sorry, Whitney. This is Christina Gare from Roaring Fork Valley. I guess I had the same question about that because there is, I mean, just going through this, there's a lot of requirements on the reporting side. So I would love to talk about the indirect and then also just have a follow-up with that because that is a significant challenge for those of us who are doing the admin piece.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's talk about it. But just really quick, 10% indirect cost is allowed on each component. So you wouldn't have to submit like your typical backup documentation for that. You can do the 10% for each line item to kind of help for those administrators. Kristen.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So we just had a question. We are planning to use these funds for rental assistance for our existing rapid rehousing clients, but we were a little confused because I believe the HUD definition for rapid rehousing requires that clients be literally homeless. So we just want to make sure that we can use this for rental assistance.
Yeah, so your clients that were already a part of the program will still hold that literally homeless status until they are no longer a participant in the program.
Gotcha. Okay, that is really helpful to know. Thank you so much.
Of course.
All right, and we have some questions in the chat. So Tim asked for clarification on what qualifies as a participant self-certification. So that is essentially them writing, yes, I am currently experiencing homelessness, or yes, I am going to be evicted, and signing their name and dating it. It does need to be signed and dated in front of a staff member. Let's see. Are pre-award costs prior to the effective date allowed? Oh, it looks like Olivia answered that. They are not for this grant. For monitoring, how often will grant managers be visiting our sites? So we don't really have like a specific schedule on how many times. HUD does require that we complete on-site visits, especially for shelters, at least once every 3 years. So we will be visiting. We may visit more than that. It really is just dependent on your needs as a program. And I know that some people really like having people come to visit their sites. So it kind of is just dependent, but at least once every 3 years. Whitney, this one might be for you. How do you list the indirect costs and document on the cover sheet?
You will just list it on there as a line item. You will put indirect costs under whatever component you're attaching it to with up to 10%, and that is it. Your grant manager is not going to ask for other documentation to prove that you did that 10%. Any other questions? I think there's a question about oh, you already answered that. Anything else?
There's a couple more. Looks like Steve has one about cafe. Kat, I don't know if you want to give a brief overview of that, and then maybe Steve, you can reach out to Kat with more specific questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so funding for emergency shelter as well as housing. So Steve, are you talking about emergency shelter and rapid rehousing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So it will be able to count clients from both programs. When you pull your CAPER, it should pull from all ESG programs.
Okay.
So it should count in the quarterly report. And kind of like Whitney said, we are struggling through some bugs with Cafe. So we're working on it.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Examples of homeless verification documents and policies around this. So examples of homeless verification documents, that could be if a person has been in Cafe or HMIS. So I know like in HMIS, you can actually print a record of services received. That would count. If they were provided street outreach, you could have the referral from the street outreach worker. And then policies around this. So I have a couple of agencies that have done a really good job setting out policies around homeless verification documents. And Holly, I'll go ahead and I'm going to make a note to send those out to you, just so that you can kind of see. And if there's anybody else who is interested in getting those examples of policies around that, feel free to let me know. ESG cover sheet on your website. Oh, it requires access. Okay, we can definitely fix that. And I think that was all of the questions. All right, Paul, I've got you written down as well. And Marissa, I've got you too. It would help if I could find sticky notes.
Sweet. Okay, and after this recording, once we have it in the correct format, we will send an email to you all with this recording. We will likely just go ahead and add those resources Kat is discussing, as well as we do have a new listserv that we are trying to implement, which will be attached to that email. If there's anything else you guys need, please let us know. Thank you for all of your hard work on reading those drafts. Again, we're here if you need anything, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us. All right, well, have a great day. Stay warm out there.
Whitney, hold on. I'm copying down emails. Just don't end it yet.